Conference. Thank you for coming to this last session of today's most interesting and enlightening conference in honor of Professor Gideon Shimoni. The topic of this session, namely Jewish peoplehood in higher education, is a necessary complementary aspect of the general theme of this conference, as it attempts to provide insights and to interpret the very basic element of whether ethnic studies in general and Jewish studies in particular are recognized today as a legitimate and integral part of the curriculum in academic institutions, the extent of research or teaching of Jewish education, their nature, and their development and ramifications over time. But the place and the importance of Jewish education go, I think, beyond the ivory tower. In the diaspora, they attest to the acceptance and or to wider social and cultural processes of acceptance and integration of minorities versus segregation, the openness and the readiness of the general society to study and to better understand the other, namely the Jews, and the interest of the Jews in their own history and group heritage, hence religious and ethnic identity. And this last component is also very relevant here in Israel, but in a Jewish sovereign state, it also reflects the priority given to Jewish studies by the governmental system, which further affect, among other things, also the academic institutions. And in this regard, let me quote the late Moshe Davis, who is also the founder of the Institute of Contemporary Jewry, from an article that he contributed to the project of teaching Jewish civilizations. And this is my own translation from a version, the only version that I find, which was somewhat surprisingly in Hebrew. The challenge at this time is to successfully reach those with academic education and advanced levels of knowledge and understanding in those societies where interest in things Jewish is second in priority. Unfortunately, the knowledge even of those who did receive formal Jewish education is very limited. Academia, by its nature, is a continuum of education and learning. Herein, the Jewish and the university ideals mingle. As this ideal lights our path, the university campus, where on average between 25 and 85% of all Jewish youth in the various countries are enrolled, might become a meeting place for those who adhere to Judaism, with those indifferent to it, and with those who are seeking the way. If Jewish spiritual values can occupy their hearts during the formative years in which their future is determined, it may be assumed that they will maintain a Jewish orientation also in the years ahead. If Jewish topics are taught as part of the general curriculum, the youth will not need to be hidden citizens on campus. Thus, the university can become an arena of self-discovery and adjustment for these Jews. There is, of course, the bothersome question which delves into the heart of this academic project, namely the anticipated tension between the aim of research and science at the university and the public striving for Jewish identification and attachment. The debate over this continues. Indeed, almost all scholars fear the possibility of damage to objective research if we go too far in our aspirations to turn the classroom into a platform for Judaism. But the dominating view, which is encoded in experience, is that there is no contradiction between the two aims. A scholar's wish to achieve the highest level in his specific research and teaching area does not by itself hinder him from taking the opportunity to awaken and enhance feelings of Jewish identity among the younger generation. It is possible to find and maintain the balance between Jewish studies as a fundamental component of human culture and Jewish studies as an ingrained component in the soul of a Jew who wishes to better understand himself. end of quote. And with this as a background, if each of the three presenters today will approach the topic of Jewish peoplehood in higher education from a somewhat different geographic, disciplinary angle, nevertheless complementary to one another, covering the major centers of Jewish life today and from the two disciplines of humanities and the social sciences. And we shall first hear the three lectures, taking them in the same order as they appear in the program, and then we'll open the floor for questions and discussion. The first speaker is Professor Eli Lederhendler. Professor Lederhendler holds the Stephen S. Weiss Chair in American Jewish History and Institutions at the Institute of Contemporary Jewry of the Hebrew University. He has written on aspects of Jewish culture and identity in the United States, and is currently preparing a study of the social and economic aspects of the East European Jewish immigration to America. Professor Lederhendler will speak today on Jewish studies between ethnicity and integration.
Thank you, Uzi. A few initial words first to Gidi. I think we've all been to more than one or more than several Jewish conferences where the meaning of Jewishness and Jewish peoplehood and Jewish identity have been debated, and some of these have been, some of these gatherings and conferences are known to become contentious. This conference, as we have witnessed over the last few days, stands out for the degree of rationality, lucidity, and plain friendliness that has come through all of the sessions and discussions, and I think it's certainly in keeping and quite appropriate in a conference honoring Gidi, because I could think of no other words to characterize him than such collegial, sophisticated, and thoughtful phrases. I want to thank you personally for being such a nice co-worker over these years, and I want to let you know that I would be personally very grateful if you would decide to come back into active service. And as Uzi said, I'm going to talk about the topic Jewish studies between ethnicity and integration. But I'm going to lead up to that slowly, because this being the last session, I do want to address what I think is one of the central issues that we've been asked to consider throughout these proceedings. The peoplehood of the Jews is a socially constructed, formal definition of group character and group boundaries. And like all such definitions, it grows out of underlying social realities, without which it would carry no credibility or authority among the group's members. Differences and boundaries are prior to the articulation of group solidarity at the level of discourse as an idea. Various media have existed historically for the expression and transmission of the idea of Jewish peoplehood, and most notably, of course, in the liturgical texts, ceremonies, and canonical literature that have been in constant use by Jews throughout the world to one extent or another since late antiquity. And perhaps its most famous and most concise discursive form, embodying the notion of Jewish uniqueness or chosenness, is contained in the formula Asher bachar banu mikol am v'kiddeshanu b'mitzvotav. The question of how this myth or ideational projection has fared since the relative waning of Jewish religious practice in the modern era, including a prolonged discomfort in many circles with the notion of divine chosenness, provides the sense of uncertainty that the title of this conference conveys. The reality of Jewish peoplehood has not in itself turned into myth, quite the contrary. Social and historical realities over the past century have only tended to confirm some of the empirical bases of Jewry's collective existence, ranging from group boundary reinforcement by governmental legislation under certain 20th century regimes, various international forms of recognition, state sovereignty, and perhaps most significantly, the consolidation of a dominant Hebrew-speaking public culture in Israel in what is or will become the single largest concentration of Jews in the world. What is at stake in the leading question, the contemporary peoplehood of the Jews, myth or reality, what is at stake is not the facts of life, as it were, but their representation in the form of social and cultural discourse. The question as it has been formulated here relates indeed specifically to the mythic or ideational projection of Jewry in the contemporary world. What do the Jews themselves think and say about the concept of peoplehood? How strongly is it disseminated? To what degree does it command acceptance, respect, and behavioral response among subgroups and individuals who define themselves as Jews? To whom and by whom is the idea of Jewish peoplehood projected? These, needless to say, in the present context, are subjects that have engaged Gidi Shimoni's attention in his scholarly endeavors over the years. His magisterial work, The Zionist Ideology, is precisely that, a study of ideology, the representational and discursive expression of an abstraction, or myth, if you will. Gidi defines ideology, however, as, quote, an action-oriented set of ideas, a cognitive map of positions and purposes, and thus he sets it off from simple myth. Ideology is related to program, to rational processes, and thus may in the end blend with reality. This trajectory from thought to action is what is conveyed in the word movement, and it is fair to say that Gidi's interest in ideology finds its focus in the notion of a movement rather than in ideas simply as abstract refractions of reality. Still, Gidi raises the ultimate question, as he puts it: what is primary, the idea or the material reality? Does the ideology give rise to the praxis, or is it merely a reflection of the praxis? Unquote. He claims that his book does not pretend to answer that question, and indeed he's called us all here together in order to shift that burden on to the rest of us. Yet I do not think that I err too much if I suggest that Gidi has entertained, if not an answer, then at least a method for dealing with the question. Part 3 of his book is entitled Fundamental Issues, and Gidi presents two questions as being fundamental to Zionism as an idea. One is the Zionist formulation of Jewish rights to sovereignty in the land of Israel. The other is Jewish peoplehood itself, or as he put it, Zionism as secular Jewish identity. He ends the chapter on identity with the juxtaposition between the religious and the secular political sanction for Jewish nationality, quoting the words of Yechezkel Kaufman. Our situation is truly tragic, Kaufman had written, the situation of those who, having lost their religious faith without hope of recovering it, still cling to that entire national universe which depended upon that faith for its life. And Gidi then writes as follows: since Kaufman certainly did not advocate a return to religious belief as a viable option, his analysis implied that all conscious attempts to shape future Jewish identity through Zionism were futile, with the emphasis on conscious. In the diaspora, it had no long-term future. In a territorial homeland, it would develop spontaneously, as did the national cultural identity of all territorial nations. I suggest, if I may, please correct me if I'm wrong, that Gidi agrees on the theoretical level with Kaufman's analysis, namely that consciousness per se does not constitute a prior cause of national life and logically cannot willfully be substituted for it, as consciousness is the product and the projection of objective conditions, and that peoplehood as an amalgam of myths and realities is ultimately either religious diasporic or else territorially based and political. That is how I read Giddy's concluding speculation, the life of the Jews, quote, the life of the Jews as an entity, a major part of which constitutes a nation, but whose other parts will remain units of a postmodern, largely religious, ethnic group, might provide, quote, the seed of a new dialectic that may yet prove ideologically schismatic in Jewish life. Yet it would not be too far off the mark to say that his approach differs from Kaufman's in that, in the end, Giddy believes that ideology matters, and very much so. After all, it is for that reason that he's devoted so much intellectual energy to exploring the topic. Ideology does matter because, while it is secondary to other underlying structures of social existence, it is also in itself a dynamic factor in our understanding of our existence. And out of understanding may come behavioral response. And it is here that we approach the topic of my discussion today, the role of the academy and of academics in ideological production. In the very opening phrases of his book, Giddy acknowledges his intellectual debt to two scholars who preceded him in wrestling with these issues, Ben Halperin, author of The Idea of the Jewish State, published in 1961, and Arthur Hertzberg, author of the ever-popular source book, The Zionist Idea, published in 1959 originally, and reprinted since then on many occasions. Both of them have since passed away. Halperin, who was born in 1912 in Boston, died in 1990, and Hertzberg, born in 1921 in Poland, died only this past April of 2006. Neither one has yet received much scholarly attention, although between them they wrote several significant works in modern Jewish history and contemporary studies. Both men emerged from a life of Jewish praxis, from the mid-30s to the mid-40s of the 20th century, to become what we today would call public intellectuals. And indeed, their roles in public life tended perhaps to overshadow their contributions as American Jewish academics. Halperin and Hertzberg both served actively in leadership capacities in Jewish and Zionist organizations, and both published numerous essays on issues of the day, on Israel and the Middle East, Jewish identity, the American Civil Rights Movement, and black nationalism in its relation to the Jews of America. Hertzberg, of course, was the longtime spiritual leader of a conservative congregation, Temple Emmanuel, in Englewood, New Jersey. Halperin was editor of the labor Zionist journal, Jewish Frontier, and many considered him to be the leading labor Zionist ideologue of his generation in America. Their careers began at a time when the field of Jewish studies in American universities was in its hesitant infancy, a far cry from the growth industry that it represents today. Halperin was educated at Harvard, a problematic, even inhospitable, yet enormously stimulating environment for young Jews who flocked to the American Athens between the two world wars. His doctoral advisor was Harry Wolfson, the eminent scholar of Jewish philosophy, but he chose to write his thesis in the historical sociological style he gleaned from reading Yechezkel Kaufman on the topic, Certain Sociological Aspects of the Jewish Problem in Christian Europe Prior to the 19th Century. He would eventually return to his native Boston to become a professor of Jewish studies at Brandeis University. Hertzberg, who immigrated to America as a young child, emerged from a strictly Orthodox rabbinical household in Baltimore to attend the WASP-dominated Johns Hopkins University, from which he went on to study for the rabbinate at the Jewish Theological Seminary and for a doctorate in history under Sela Baron at Columbia. His doctoral thesis, later his important published study, The French Enlightenment and the Jews, The Origins of Modern Anti-Semitism, published in 1968, led him, rather like Halperin, back before the 19th century to what both men found to be the earliest historical foundations of the modern Jewish problem. Interestingly, when Hertzberg served as a Hillel rabbi for college campuses in Massachusetts, just after his ordination from the seminary in 1943, he took the opportunity to study for a year at Harvard under Halperin's old tutor, Wolfson. The brilliant Litvak philosopher impressed Herzberg with his daring efforts to position the heritage of Hellenistic Judaism as a preeminent root source of Western culture. And the encounter with Wolfson prompted Herzberg to wonder, as he put it in his memoir, can Jewish learning ever be value-free? When Herzberg eventually published his book on the Enlightenment, he would write in his preface, "The inception of this study was obviously motivated by more than historical curiosity, for the meaning of the emancipation and the nature and roots of contemporary anti-Semitism have remained for 2 centuries great questions for the Jews and for the larger society, which has both accepted and attacked them." At that point, Herzberg had already published his anthology, The Zionist Idea, whose 100-page introduction is a valuable monographic work in its own right. Later in life, Herzberg turned to the American scene and wrote a 1-volume survey of U.S. Jewish history, a rather polemical work, like all of Herzberg's books, in which he blended his sense for historical complexity with his Judaic commitments. He taught Jewish history for various periods at Dartmouth College, at New York University, and at Columbia. To Halperin, no less than to Herzberg, as to Gidi Shimoni, ideology mattered. And though Halperin was at pains to present his work as explaining the Zionist idea, he was forthright in speaking as an insider. For Halperin, ideology is what set Zionism apart from other national movements. The Jewish national ideology, he argued, was framed in diaspora conditions, and thus had to deal with a wide range of social realities affecting various Jewish populations. It was always, by the same token, an alternative to other ideal formulations of Jewish solidarity, religious as well as cultural or political, which held sway in the Jewish world. This very lack of national consensus meant that the articulation of national consciousness as such, not rebellion against foreign masters or a struggle for territorial independence, was the earliest and most basic focus of Zionist activity. Without struggle for the myth, there could be no reality. To Halperin, this preeminence of the ideational element as a defining characteristic in the genesis of Zionism indicates that state sovereignty could be said to be subordinate in Zionist ideology to a prior and higher aim, namely the restoration of a global Jewish peoplehood, somewhat akin to the solidarity once achieved with great success by Jews under the aegis of religious Judaic values and practice, an idea that Halperin had gleaned from Yechezkel Kaufman. This point of view would look askance at both extreme Jewish Palestinocentrism on the one hand, and at would-be rival ideologies of a religious, pluralistic, non-national or cosmopolitan character on the other. It was Zionism that Halperin identified as subsuming in its national ideology a variety of aims, not all of which were necessarily dependent upon state sovereignty, but all of which were commensurate with a renewed definition of a world Jewry. Such a Jewry, as Halperin wrote in his study about the clash between Louis Brandeis and Chaim Weizmann, was far more compelling than, quote, the narrow confines of the synagogue and a merely philanthropic relation to co-religionists, unquote. And by the same token, Jewish statehood once achieved was ever being challenged and shaped by other peoplehood aims and interests, primarily related to the lives of Jews elsewhere in the world. Halperin, like Gidi, always had his sights on the diaspora communities, convened, as it were, around the national entity, but also pursuing their own agendas, needs, and interests. Although both Halperin and Herzberg were, as noted, quite active in the public forum, I think we can safely conjecture that it will be their academic activity as teachers and as scholars that will remain of lasting significance. They may fairly be credited with planting on American soil a branch of Zionist historiography, a branch that has sprouted since then and produced an admittedly select club, And among its members, and this is certainly not an exhaustive list, I would include such people as Naomi Cohen, Aryeh Goren, whose academic career forms a bridge between New York and Jerusalem, Yehuda Reinhardt, whose work closely dovetailed with Halperin's, and who presently is, of course, the president of Brandeis University, and most recently a younger scholar, Mark Rader, and many others, and I won't go on to enumerate other people. But outside of historiography, let's say, I would point to such scholars in the American Academy, such as Robert Alter in literature, and indeed some of our distinguished guests right here at this conference, whose life work is clearly delineated by Zionist connections and aspirations. Their respective careers span the decades from the early flowering of Jewish studies in American universities in the 1960s to the burgeoning of the field in recent years. Like Halperin and Herzberg, they have had to wrestle with the terms under which ideology enters the academy, although these days, in which all academic discourse is frankly and avowedly considered ideological, Herzberg's query as to Jewish studies and value-free education must appear almost quaint. In the few minutes remaining, I would like to point out that the pursuit of academic Jewish studies today serves an ideological function indeed. It is much the same function as that which was once served by those 19th century journalists, writers, autodidactic scholars, poets, intellectuals, and scientists who made up that Jewish public square out of which emerged the modern mythic and political expressions of Jewish peoplehood. The opening of the American Academy to Jewish Studies as an integral part of the humanities curriculum is undoubtedly a mark of the successful social integration of U.S. Jewry, and by the same token, the very advancement of the field is an ideological complement to that integration process. Once again, we see that ideology grows out of the stuff of history. Yet at the same time, those men and women whose job it is to explore, query, critique, restate, and transmit the cultural baggage that has defined Jewry in the past are eminently engaged in a rite of peoplehood. That's praxis. Thus poised between ethnicity and integration, the Jewish studies field has the potential for providing ideological reinforcement for cultural accommodationism, though it also provides an arena for a self-affirming identity, just as Halperin and Herzberg had sketched out. Indeed, they would no doubt have said that where the institutional pressures for accommodation and integration are strongly in evidence, it is the task of the Jewish scholar and intellectual to exert countervailing ideological weight in the opposite direction. In any event, the streaming of Jewish studies within American humanistic academic culture exemplifies the liminal quality of Jewish peoplehood that Giddy and we all have tried and no doubt will go on trying to pin down and understand. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Lederhendler, for sharing with us your insightful analysis of the scholarly work and institutional involvement of two major figures of Jewish studies in the American academia. The next speaker is Professor Haim Avni, who is Professor Emeritus of the Institute of Contemporary Jewry, also here at the Hebrew University, where he served as the director of the Division for Latin America, Spain, and Portugal, and in the early 90s also as the head of the Institute. Currently, Professor Avni is the academic director of the Central Zionist Archives, and Professor Avni's talk today is on the study of contemporary Jewry in a university context, the view from Latin America.
It's a pleasure, Gidi, to participate in this celebration, Your Honor. I don't know why, but in the remote memory of mine, somewhere at Beit Berl in Tzofit, we were discussing the eventuality of your coming to the Institute of Contemporary Jewry after we were in the Machon Lemadrichei Chutz Laaretz, and that was many years ago. When Sergio asked me to offer an outline, I promised you to talk about the legitimacy of being Jewish, anti-Semitism, the socio-economic stratification and the diversity of Jewish identities as they developed during the second half of the 20th century in Latin America, and their significance for university research and teaching global contemporary Jewry and Latin American studies. Well, I will really comply with my obligations as long as the chairman is going to stop me, or as long as my material is going to end what comes first. The very question mark which has been put here, myth or reality, brought to my mind a text which is not too very ancient, but actually 48 years ago, in May 1959, the Hybrid Convincent World Union for the first time, and for the first time any world or large American organization did convene in Jerusalem, B'nai Umah, and Yitzhak Ben Tzvi, you remember, it's not a street, it's a president, he said the following: I would like to emphasize the importance I place on an idea recently born among some of us to establish here in Israel an institute for the study of contemporary Jewish life. This institute will provide extensive training for students and teachers alike. From it will flow a wealth of knowledge concerning the ways of life of Jewish communities both in the East and the West, the origins of the European catastrophe. At that time, Shoah was not yet a term used, at least not in English, and those of the rebirth of the land of Israel, together with the data of contemporary Jewish history, will come within its scope. The last speaker on that pamphlet, which was, had the title of Spoke in Jerusalem at the B'nai Brit Convention, and published in Washington in the same year, 1959, the last speaker was the founder of our institute, Moshe Davis, who at that time was still presented as the provost of the Jewish Theological Seminary. I believe that that was the last time that that kind of title of his was presented, and eventually, because at B'nai Brit it's much better to be לא ראש המכון ליהדות זמננו, but rather in the making, but rather the provost of the JTS. Now, I say that at this time there was no problem about a myth or reality, because it was considered to be reality. And the Institute of Contemporary Jewry, by the way, because of difficulties of translation from Hebrew to English and from English to Hebrew, we should prefer the English in this case, because we're talking about contemporary Jewry, while Machon Liyahadut Zmanenu usually brought me to the I will say, to the confusion when, again, b'shirut miluim, they heard Machon Leyadut Zmanenu, they told me, yes, the rabbi is there at the Midbach, go to talk to him, and so on. So this is the, so in this case, really, English is much better. But as you well also know, that this same pamphlet has a Hebrew title, which says, Ayudim Bizmanenu Ke'am. And because of the difficulties for North Americans to understand nation as Am, we are emerging into peoplehood and other things, and without that difficulty, of course, there eventually wouldn't be a conference such beautiful as we have here today. Anyhow, the question of the legitimacy. And I know from Gidi that a lot of discussions were held, not at the Machon, very interestingly, about how you define Yahadut Zmanenu. And I'm not going into this area, but I think that one of the elements which could be brought into forward is not that much boundaries and inside products, but rather an effort to look into basic problems and issues and check their validity throughout those who call themselves Jewish. And throughout these 3 days, we heard a lot of definitions on both sides, from inside and outside, who could come into this consideration. And immediately Sergio DellaPergola will give us a very clear demographic definition, whom they count as Jews. Now, here in this context, I would say we didn't bother very much at the Machon Liadut Zmanenu because we considered to be here on Mount Scopus really something of self-evident. Well, I must tell you, 40 years ago exactly, and that's really one of the reasons why I insisted that Latin America should be included in the program. 40 years ago exactly, that was the first time that the Hebrew University of Jerusalem had a course on Latin American Jewry. The division is now celebrating also 40 years of its existence, starting from that course. It was not only the first course in the Hebrew University of Jerusalem, to the best of my knowledge, it was the first course given at any university, wherever throughout the world. Now, the idea of that context was that if you, through the time, if you have to defend the validity of Yahadut Zmanenu, or the legitimacy of Yahadut Zmanenu as an academic area, definitely within the field you have to defend the legitimacy of Yahadut America Latinit. And it really started to bother us when the Institute of Contemporary Jewry was active in 2 or 3 operations. The one when Moshe Davis, Shalom, founded the International Center for Teaching of University Teaching of Judaism, and that was not anymore for local consumption, but rather also for exportation the world over. It was in particular case of Latin America, where the case when we had to propose a program of studies on contemporary Jewry at the Jewish school system in Mexico, and throughout there to other parts. In other words, the idea, what are you including, or rather, what is your right of existence as part in order to really suggest subject matter to a university as such, and also to create an educational system for on contemporary Jewry. As a matter of fact, the Institute of Contemporary Jewry, through its division on Latin America, was instrumental also in the creation of the worldwide organization, Latin American Jewish Studies Association. You never heard the name LAJSA, many of you didn't hear. Well, LAJSA, because J in Spanish is pronounced as a chet and not as a J. But the Latin American Jewish Studies Association is convening this year for this 13th international conference, in which people from all over the world are discussing subjects related to all the disciplines regarding Jews literature in Latin America. I mean, the very definition of this case had to come to the fore in that kind of a challenge. Now, basic issues which could and should be studied regarding Latin America, not the exclusive one. It's going to be a whole half-a-year course if we continue like that, but rather just some highlights in which I would like to emphasize the validity, not for Latin America, but for contemporary Jewry, the significance of these studies, and in order to go on and to see it in a broader way. I said basic issues which cover the world over. The legitimacy of being different is no question, if not the basic, one of the basic issues which Jews, and not only Jews of course, and whatever of these basic issues are not regarding, are not Jewish, didn't have Brit Milah, they are issues which every kind of group like the Jews could really consider as their own basic issues, but the legitimacy of being different, which is valid in each one of the Jewish diasporas, gets in Latin America a very special shade. And the reason for that is that contrary to any other new diaspora, South Africa, Canada, Australia, United States, there was no problem in the initiation of the Jewish community there, as it was the case in Latin America as actually as a possession of the Iberian powers. As a matter of fact, there was no crime to be Jewish, even when you were deported from England into Australia at those times, Or when you came to the United States, there was a crime being Jewish. It was a crime being Jewish in Latin America, and there was the Inquisition. Now, the abolishment of the Inquisition was not anything to do with the Jews. They abolished it because the Inquisition depended on the Spanish crown, and as a part of the independence of Latin America, they had to abolish the Inquisition. So they abolished also the criminality of being Jewish. They didn't institute the legitimacy of being Jewish, because that continued as an illegitimate for a long while in many parts of Latin America. In other words, the starting point of the legitimacy of being different in Latin America nowadays, the starting point is below zero, while in all the other parts of the world it is quite above zero. We know definitely well that the case is not a Jewish issue. 3 girls in France 20 years ago who insisted, because being Muslim, to go to school with a head cover of as a Muslim, created a havoc in France. And there, if you believe it, you please are invited to consult the 2 volumes of 769-1 and 272 continuous, volume 1, volume 2, which have the title Être français aujourd'hui et demain, Paris 1988, which had to answer the question, le droit actuel de la nationalité est-il encore adapté à la situation de France? And that was the records which were transmitted on the TV, had to discuss what are the limits of the legitimacy of being different in France. What's going on in France today, I don't have to tell you, you see the news like me. It's not only a question of there, we have the extreme other case in Canada, where being different was completely limited to the question of French and English up to, is that right, Michael, up to 1950s, and then came the big immigration, and Canada became the mecca of the multiculturalism, which I believe that is one of the few, if not the only, country in which it is anchored in the laws as part and parcel of the self-identity of Canada. Now, this question of being different is not a Jewish question, neither of minorities. It's in the first place the case of the majority society. Because being legitimate to wear this head cover of the Muslims implied that France becomes, in a way that even includes in its self-image the possibility of being French and having to move with that cover head, and by the way also with the kippah. It is a question in each of the countries which shows the limits of legitimacy as a question for the minorities. It's a question for the whole society, and since we are a whole society, every one of you is invited to look into ourselves and see what are the limits of being different in our society, which are, of course, different. So here you find that this issue is, in the case of Latin America, very much, I would say, basic, and it differs from one country to another. And differs also in time, as it did and is going on. In other words, while legality and emancipation and equality are anchored in laws which are apparently non-immutable, in the case of legitimacy, it's a fluid situation, and research and study of that phenomena, so basic for the Jewish existence, but not only Jewish existence, is, of course, one of the elements which justify contemporary Jewry to be taught. I will, Okay. Well, anti-Semitism. There are no people more enthusiastic about anti-Semites than the Jews are. If you want, the proof is also in contemporary Jewry, which was the co-founder of the Center for the Research on Anti-Semitism. In other words, wherever you have an anti-Semite saying something, you have him immortalized in indexes, in quotations, and so on. My point is that Latin America tells us also the limits of this whole sport. Anti-Semitism, in my consideration, should be differentiated into two parts, and all of you will agree. The one is popular anti-Semitism, the sum total of prejudices and animosities toward Jews and so on, and the other is state anti-Semitism. The most complete state anti-Semitism is, of course, German Nazi, but it's legitimate always to ask to what extent is state anti-Semitism existent, and the answer to that is, let us see who is now in power, and let us see how close to decision makers are anti-Semites, and let us see how much is anti-Semitism really vital in their policy. Because you had in Brazil integralistas, which were anti-Semites, but were not exactly anti-Semitism, was not that much of the main argument and activity. Yeah, but here, that is exactly where state anti-Semitism starts, then the Jewish destiny is more or less sealed. Because when anti-Semites get into power and have the police and have all whatever a state power gives to them, then of course we are in real trouble. They might be coming from as a group into power, they might be emerging from downstairs, it is always. Now, I must tell you that the number of publications on anti-Semitism in Latin America outnumbers almost any other subject. And I believe that if most of you would be asked whether Argentina is anti-Semitic, the answer would be definitely yes, for too many. And the reason for it is very simple. Because when there is anti-Semitism, that is news, and it gets through the Jewish world. When there is no anti-Semitism, in other words, regular Jewish activities and even sensational Jewish activities like celebrations and so on, these are no news for the Jewish media, and that is on the column. Now the point is that in this context, Latin America tells us a whole variety. For instance, you had anti-Semites in the foreign ministries of Argentina and Brazil. They did their best to block immigration during the Holocaust. You did not have any persecution of those same refugees who managed to come illegally into these countries. No Minister of the Interior, no police, no sanctions, not to mention any persecution of Jews, while the foreign ministry was anti-Semitic. You have Lázaro Cárdenas in Mexico, a very tough guy. And he allowed Spanish refugees to come in. He brought in also the money of the Spanish Republic. But at the time when he wanted to give something also to a program for absorbing a larger group of Jews, he gave in. Hero Mr. Cárdenas, because he was told that public opinion is too much anti-Semitic, and there were camisas doradas, there were golden shirts, anti-Semitic, who refugees from Germany told that when they came to Mexico City, they felt like in Berlin. Now, here you have again, this situation, you have Bolivia. Well, Bolivia rescued at least 10,000 Jews through corruption, but they allowed them to come in. And there was a tremendous anti-Semitism in Bolivia. Bolivia rescued 10,000 Jews. Canada, throughout the whole 12 years of the Nazi era, did, sum total, have 4,000 Jews allowed to come into Canada. Where do you put anti-Semitism in this case? In other words, going into these details will give us a differentiation and will tell us something more, which unfortunately, to my big I would say pain, is not really brought forward. Jews are not alone. Jews are not alone at this moment when everybody is talking about anti-Semitism, anti-Zionism in Europe. In the same Argentina which denied entry, there was a broad coalition coming from the communist elements down to certain moderate Catholics, and which created a comité contra el antisemitismo y el racismo, contra el racismo y el antisemitismo, racism and anti-Semitism, and which convened two large international congresses, and which deplored the government to change its attitude. In other words, there is a lot of reason to fight anti-Semitism, not because anti-Semites themselves are curable, but because they have to be fought against through our allies or potential allies in the general society. And then Latin America, in this case, when you go to details not on Argentina, you will find a lot of things. Now I would like to focus on 2 points, just to, because Sergio is going to give us immediately later a kind of a statistics. My point is, demography. Demographic information. אז אני כעת מתוח לשמוע. Anyhow, my point is that in Latin America, 2 elements of qualitative, quantitative investigations are at point. The one, how does it come that 4,000 Jews in Peru create an impression among Peruvians that they are a legion? How does it come that the Minister of the Interior at the home of the ambassador of Israel tells the ambassador that, sure, in Argentina there are 1 million Jews? Ask Sergio, he will tell you that at that time, 180,000. How does it come that the division for demography was pressed by the Israeli ambassador not to publish the fact that there are no 500,000 Jews, as usually the Jewish publications did publish? How many Jews in Argentina? 500,000. And then the investigation showed that there were never more than 310, and there came the phone of Alava Shalom, the ambassador, please don't publish it because they are going to lose their fear. Well, anti-Semites know that we are dominating the world. They won't lose their fear, and hopefully they will never lose their fear from us. But the idea of having this over-representation is in Latin American research lab very much obvious. Chavez, the new Haim of Latin America, he has at most 12,000, if you want, 15,000 Jews in Caracas. Now, how many shchunot in Jerusalem do we have to walk in order to have 15,000 Jews? In other words, but still, it is not a legend. They are visible, they are there. In other words, contemporary Jewry is something which is not represented by its figures, and other kinds of evaluation should be developed in Latin America because of its small communities and concentrated, both geographically and both professionally, and because of that much also out on the street. Yes, Lidaka? In Uruguay there were 2 dailies in Yiddish. And that's a story of 1965. And I knew that, and I asked one of the editors, tell me, how come you can't publish 2 dailies, one communist and one non-communist? And they said, very simple, because the Goyim are paying the ads. Why should they pay the ads? They walk the main street, they see how many business are Jewish, and they conclude that if just in one street there are so many Jews, there must have been so many more, and evident Jews have money, and evident Jews are buying, so why not put their ads into? Unfortunately, somebody told them this is a secret, and after a short while, the papers disappeared. But anyhow, that is a kind of a presentation, of a presence, which is a real presence. It's not imaginary, but should be investigated. Latin America allows itself. That's one aspect. And the other aspect is the fact that Jewish life, as immediately going to hear, is not dependent on the statistics of Jewish demography. Jewish life is dependent on the amount of public Jewish energy which any given community is producing. And public Jewish energy means things which you can see and count, because you have schools, you have a Havre Kadisha, Lehavdil, you have you You know, Jewish public life is like every public life, out in the public. So go from one community to another and see how much is there of Jewish presence, how much opportunities for Jewish activity of any kind is being presented through in that local community. And then you might find out something extraordinary. The 35,000 Jews in Mexico, and eventually a little less, are producing a phenomenon of more than 70 or 80% of all the children from kindergarten to the end of high school at Jewish schools. In fact, you will find 5 campuses, not just schools. Go and see it. You will find you'll find a semi-university emerging. You will find not only a club, of course, which is self-evident since the 1960s in every community. In other words, how do you measure 35,000 Jews when you now cross the border to the north, go to any community of that size in the United States, and look how many public energy is there reflected in the same size? Each place has its reasons, but research on these reasons is definitely something which should be the basis. I touched just 4 of these elements. I could give you 3 or 4 more as basic issues, basic problems, in which could be justifying the approach of a worldwide Jewish peoplehood or Am Yehudi, call it whatever you want, in all its dimensions. And I must tell you that even if education is not sent by very assimilated Jews, it's still a problem. It might not be evident at the level of organization. It might be on the level of sentiment. It is really one of the elements, one of the approaches which would justify contemporary Jewry. Let me end by saying the following. First of all, the Jewish case is not only Jewish. Just this afternoon I was given a paper published by 2 of my colleagues, Jeffrey Lesser and Ranan Rein. Jeffrey Lesser from the United States, Ranan Rein is the vice dean and vice rector now in the University of Tel Aviv. And they called their paper Challenging Particularity, Jews as Lens on Latin America Ethnicity. Well, I would argue with them with a challenging of particularity because they take the pendulum out of the Jewish sphere altogether. But their main argument is study Jews in Latin America and you will learn a lot about other comparable and similar Jewish ethnic groups and learn much better about the whole society. And I definitely sustain this approach. In other words, it's completely legitimate to come to a professor of Latin American studies, non-Jewish Latin American studies, and tell you you don't know how much you miss by the fact that you don't have the Jewish case included in your program. Go ahead and do it. And the second business is, of course, Jewish education. And here, again, I must tell you that without teaching contemporary Jewry, and starting, of course, with local, and I'm afraid that's really what's happening throughout the Jewish education at large. You don't socialize, you don't educate the younger generation to become part and parcel of your community. What is it that you don't really reveal them the secrets of their own development? There, at Tarbut School, we try to teach them what does it mean voluntary association. And we try to ask the children, do you know who created this school? And of course children don't like a school to which they are obliged to go. But once we made a meeting with the patronato, with the organization, they started to understand that that is a function of voluntarism, that that's a result of Jewish organization. How can you really educate future leaders without bringing contemporary Jewry in this aspect and many others, no time to go into more details, without bringing that into their program of study and of education? My point is that contemporary Jewry for Latin America starting with Latin America, for American Jewry starting with American Jewry, but never, never, never remaining within the boundaries of the local community, but rather looking into comparisons with other places in the region. Or, well, I would dream that people in America should study something about Jews in Canada. I believe that if that would be an issue, that would enrich Jewish education in America if somebody would reveal them that north of the 49th meridian there's a different community as far at least of some of the basic assumptions. And that, to my understanding, is not only legitimate from the academic point of view, it is an obligation from the education point of view. Thank you.
Statistics of Jewish life in Latin America and how they penetrate and influence academic studies and research in this part of the world. The third speaker is Professor Sergio DellaPergola, a former chairman and professor of population studies at the Institute of Contemporary Jewry, where he is incumbent of the Shlomo Argov Chair in Israel Diaspora Relations. Professor DellaPergola is also a senior fellow at the Jewish People Policy Planning Institute, which is an independent think tank here in Jerusalem. And with his wide academic experience and public activity, Professor DellaPergola will talk today on the issue of contemporary Jewry then and now.
תודה עוזי. כדי להקל, כשבאתי הנה חשבתי על people and peoplehood. I thought to people and peoplehood coming here. And I wonder whether we thought of refrigerator and refrigeratorhood. That is, refrigeratorhood would be a prerogative of being somewhat related to something that is a refrigerator. And so peoplehood, but as we shall see, I think it's appropriate. I like it and I use it. Peoplehood. I met my fellow doctoral student and later faculty colleague and friend Gideon Shimoni at the house of Moshe Davis, of blessed memory, the founder of the Institute of Contemporary Jewry. With the active help of Lottie, may she live long and healthy life, Moshe used to run at his home his legendary researcher seminar. Moshe was a uniquely gifted talent scout, and by the mysterious chemistry that he could establish, he was able to discover several younger and unknown researchers who later were to become influential figures in academy or in other areas of Jewish interest. In particular, many of those who became the leading teachers and his successors at the Institute owe their own human development to Moshe's initiative and insight. The Institute of Contemporary Jewry was established in 1959 at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem to create a new opportunity for university research and teaching and an academic stimulus to public discourse in areas significant to an appraisal of the Jewish experience across world Jewry and in Israel. In wishing all of my best to Gidi, who so much has contributed to the achieving of the Institute's hopes and goals and whose Shlomo Argov chair in Israel Diaspora Relations I have inherited, I would like to focus my reflection today on 5 areas of concern. 1, the early context, definition, and reception of the contemporary Jewry concept and subject matter. 2, the subsequent development of academic research and teaching and the impact of the Institute in the respective subject matter areas. 3, the need to identify new relevant subject matter to keep with the original goal of scholarly relevance in a changing time perspective. 4, the relationship between pure and applied research in the areas of concern and the attempt to create pertinent academic and non-academic frameworks. And finally, the prospects for continuity of an Institute of Contemporary Jewry in the framework of the Hebrew University's mandate and reorganization. So when founding the Institute, Moshe Davis was aware of the need to establish a linkage between universally accepted patterns and rules of academic appraisal and critique and the global, empirically existing and testable Jewish people that most recently had emerged from 2 of the most revolutionary experiences of its entire historical course, the Shoah and the independence of the State of Israel. Following the European tradition of civilization studies, and in parallel to the growing interest in ethnic and regional studies in America, the Institute aimed at establishing a coalescence of disciplinary, topical, and regional approaches. The Institute was born with a typically multicultural and comparativistic mandate. This approach was quite innovative on the Israeli scene, although the experience of regional studies was not entirely new. The main challenges were, first, to detect a comprehensive and meaningful typology of the problematics and subject matter of the contemporary Jewish world. Incidentally, the intriguing word Jewry, this has already been mentioned, which still these days so many mispronounce as Judaism, was meant precisely to signal the focus on empirical as distinct from normative realities. Unfortunately, while in English the terminological distinction is possible, this is not the case in Hebrew, with much confusion being generated. And in parentheses, again, this seems to be a case parallel to that with Peoplehood, translated in Hebrew into amiyut, which also is being received with much reservations, its clear advantages analytically notwithstanding. Second, to develop an ability by the investigator and teacher to keep dignified historical and sociological distance from the subject matter of which he/she was an integral part, and to train others in the same spirit. And third, to compete on an academic market at a level of absolute excellence by the best professional standards of research, teaching, and publication, and not by way of some parochial mercy. Since the beginning, the Institute's main disciplinary components, by calculation or by availability, were contemporary history, the social sciences, especially demography and social psychology, and literature. Following a studious intuition about the emerging realities of world Jewry after World War II, two major topical areas of concern included the study of anti-Semitism and the destruction of European Jewry, and the history of Zionism, the Yishuv, and the State of Israel. Moreover, several regional perspectives were incorporated covering the different experiences of the Jews in the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe, the United States, Latin America, the countries of the Commonwealth, and Jews in the Islamic societies of Asia and Africa. Looking at the university yearbooks of those years, one meets the small body of founders along with Moshe Davis' own interest in American Jewry, Shaul Esch on anti-Semitism and the Shoah, Shulamit Nardi on themes in Jewish literature in Jewish-speaking countries, Simon Herman on the psychological study of Jewish identity, Roberto Bacchi and Oskar Schmelz on issues in Jewish demography, Alexander Dushkin on Jewish education in the diaspora, and others. Among the many names that we meet in subsequent editions of the yearbook, I will just mention two, George Mosse and Emil Fackenheim. It will be only fair to remember that the Institute's initial concept met the steady opposition of several of the Hebrew Youth's leading academics, especially in the historiographic and Judaic studies disciplines. These senior figures in the Faculty of Humanities possibly feared the undue intromission into a well-established Jerusalem school of thought of something neither sufficiently academically proven nor even doable with acceptable standards of scientific accountability. While it will be colorful, but also fairly accurate to say that the Institute was born over the dead bodies of several of the key scholars at Hebrew U, it is also true that others quickly saw the Institute's great potentialities and advantages. Prominent among them were archaeologist Benjamin Mazar, the philosopher Nathan Rothenstreich, and with him some important figures in the social sciences, which, or perhaps because, at the time did not yet exist as a faculty separate from the Faculty of Humanities. All in all, the Institute took off. Interestingly, for many years, it rested on the shoulders of people born and trained abroad. It took 8 heads of institute, all males and born abroad, before an Israeli native and a woman became a chairperson. But today, a generation of Israeli-born and trained scholars is taking the relay and at unchanged, persistently high levels of academic performance. The Institute was, by definition, a non-historiographic department, technically defined by a condition of non-available or non-reachable archival sources, hence typically oriented by a time perspective of the last 40 to 50 years or less. Research was hence supposed to grow outside the realm of classic archival sources and had to develop pursuing innovative ad hoc research tools and methodologies. These included the development of oral history, of quantitative social surveys, of textual analysis, and at a later stage of audiovisual materials. Given the lack of systematic documentation inherent in the topics covered under the headings of the Institute, the need was immediately felt to develop a number of databases, inventories, and foundational bibliographies. Among other initiatives, large inventories of sources for the study of the Shoah were compiled. Later, large-scale bibliographies followed in the areas of Jewish demography, Jewish education in the diaspora, and anti-Semitism. Since the beginning, along with the teaching activities, disciplinary or topical divisions were established, each dealing with creating or developing basic research in their areas. Perhaps more challenging was the need to create, develop, or literally invent new concepts and tools attuned to the emerging situation of world Jewry. The changing patterns and boundaries of Jewish identification called for a sophisticated analysis of the definition of who and what is a Jew and of the different possible dimensions of Jewishness. The recent Shoah imposed in the first place a huge and painstaking effort to document what had actually occurred, why it had occurred, and what the broader and longer-lasting implications of it would be. The emphasis of the emerging historiography on the broader political framework and on the perpetrators had to be integrated and balanced with a focus on the victims and their response. The gradual emerging of the State of Israel as a new influential actor on the global Jewish scene imposed the necessity to understand and systematize its ideological premises and the patterns of political and socio-cultural development in the Yishuv that had preceded the state and in Israeli society. The very basics of stock-taking of Jewish population size, distribution, and characteristics had to be undertaken anew after the destruction not only of the main Jewish population centers, but also of the main scholarly facilities in Germany and in Eastern Europe. And as an aside, the Jewish populations most destroyed were also those better documented in the past, at least statistically. Internal and external circumstances indeed tended to develop and to affect the Jewish experience in ways that had not been known in previous research. Overall, it seems fair to say that the Institute's faculty were able to successfully fulfill the mandate they had been assigned. Success primarily consisted in having been able to firmly put on the academic agenda several areas of study that were to become a high-profile, essential component not only in the study of contemporary Jewish society, but in contemporary and comparative human and social studies at large. One may also legitimately think that in the absence of the Institute and of the tremendous stimulus it provided in methods and substance, the alternative might have been to see the same contemporary subject matter either totally neglected or confined into a rather ghettoized option of low-key local erudition and personal memory of scarce general interest or subordinate to other quote-unquote higher academic interests. One further observation concerns the role of the Institute's peculiar approach to Jewish affairs from the point of view of teaching and research training. It would appear that multidisciplinary training, such as that imparted at the Institute, has objective advantages. And indeed, the crop of the Institute's graduates at the level of masters and PhDs has proven highly successful and competitive, as shown by the absorption of many younger academics in institutions of higher learning at the Hebrew University and elsewhere in a variety of public organizations as senior research or administrative levels and in high school teaching. Now, what is contemporary Jewry? The very terms imply a time perspective that constitutes one of our major challenges. Indeed, contemporary is here all the time by definition, and it also runs ahead of us all the time. The Institute was created in 1959, 14 years after the end of World War II, 11 years after the independence of the State of Israel. As noted, the Institute was able to create a canon that reflected the huge transformations of world Jewry during the 1920s, say with the beginning of the British mandate over Palestine, through the 1950s, say with Stalin's death. This canon successfully consolidated and became a paradigm also for other higher education institutions that nurtured the project of an Institute of Contemporary Jewish Studies in Israel and elsewhere. But from the vintage point of 2007, the retrospective time distance equivalent to the one we had in 1959 would be respectively 1993 and 1996. Two dates which send us to a now surprisingly distant and evanescent memory of the signing of the Oslo agreements and Benjamin Netanyahu electoral victory over Shimon Peres. In between, let's not forget Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin had been killed. One should now ask whether events such as those of the 1990s are relevant for the shaping of contemporary Jewry in Israel and throughout the world. perhaps not as much as Shoah or Israel's independence, but yet in many meaningful ways. Are current political events and other transformations stemming from globalization processes relevant to the shaping or reshaping of Jewish identification, solidarity, institutional frameworks, and policy making? We believe that the inherent disagreements on issues like war and peace, territory and identity, or the very rules for entering and exiting the Jewish collective are matters that students of contemporary Jewry should incorporate in their reflections and translate into a methodic analysis and synthesis of the main current processes and their implications in the longer run. How can we identify a contemporary research agenda that would be the equivalent of the one initially established at the Institute? The initial research agenda allowed significant and now widely acknowledged intellectual breakthroughs, but can we now think of new breakthroughs of similar import? One answer of a sort comes from the Jewish People Policy Planning Institute, an independent think tank established in 2003 in Jerusalem. The JPPI, founded by Yecheskel Dror and chaired by Dennis Ross, constitutes an attempt to create a central tool for the appraisal of Jewish interest and response strategies at the global level. Although not an academic center in the formal sense, the JPPI does make efforts to locate the main challenges and to articulate policy suggestions for world Jewry as a complex and in its different expressions in the State of Israel and in the Jewish diaspora. The one basic assumption of JPPI is the existence of one global Jewish collective, actually Peoplehood, with good peace of the deconstructionists, the post-Zionists, and the radical postmodernists. If true, and perhaps we don't know, but supposing it is, the aggregate of a sovereign state plus a self-organizing system of voluntary community bodies may well face common strategic challenges and the need for corporate answers, no matter how differently articulated in the different contexts of Jewish existence. In one of its reports, JPPI formulated the fundamental challenges facing world Jewry as follows, and I quote, "Survival of the Jewish people is not assured, though there are great opportunities for a thriving future. Therefore, determined and large-scale efforts are needed to maximize the opportunities and ward off the dangers. Doing so requires significant resources, judicious coping with critical decisions, and a careful crafting of long-term grand policies," end quote. This was followed by a list of main challenges. One, acting to rescue Jewish communities that are still endangered in their current locations, example given Iran, and ensuring personal security for Jews worldwide. Managing Jewish sovereignty, that is, finding the balance between preserving crucial assets in the domain of security and real political interests of the Jewish state, maintaining enlightened Jewish human and social values, and deepening the ties between Israel and the diaspora. Achieving peace and security for Israel. Encouraging Jewish cultural and demographic continuity, strengthening Jewish identity, knowledge, self-respect, and participation, while sustaining Jewish population resilience and the natural process of generational replacement. Harnessing Jewish unity and solidarity, encouraging internal Jewish dialogue, mutual understanding and tolerance, consensus building and common action in the spirit of Klal Israel, the communal Jewish family, while not ignoring a wide spectrum of Jewish ideas and forms of expression. Confronting hostility toward the Jews, explaining the Jewish position, and tackling all old and new forms of intolerance and physical aggression that persist from the past or proliferate in the present. Projecting Jewish values, encouraging the study of Jewish heritage, and engaging in tikkun olam, making a uniquely Jewish contribution to the welfare and enlightenment of world society. And finally, developing Jewish human resources of the highest quality that will take the lead in accomplishing these tasks. While certainly unilaterally normative, the main interest of these JPPI formulations is twofold. On the one hand, they provide a concise list of the main areas of concern. On the other hand, they create a significant and relevant agenda for scientific research, one central aspect of which is the need to re-evaluate the nature of Israel-diaspora relations in a more complex fashion and through a greater range of mutual interactions. Along with the obviously persisting relevance of older topics, further important ones about which little is known may be thought of. I'll provide a few examples. Not so much the numbers, but the politics around the numbers. The growing complexity of Jewish identification as a multivariate, multi-layer, and increasingly hybrid composite under different skies. The economic changes in the Jewish population in the world and in different regions and their implications for Jewish life. The mutual roles of gender, family, formal and informal education, and general socioeconomic mobility in shaping the experiences and identities of contemporary Jews. The causes, modes of evolution, and consequences over time of old and new forms of religious expression and fundamentalism. What is the real contribution of Jews to contemporary society and its different sectors? What's the role of Jewish organizations worldwide in shaping the formation of Israeli society and current Jewish political agendas? And finally, what's the balance of Jewish autonomy and dependency in a global system perspective? These also seem to be some of the broader articulations around which the Institute, or an institute, see in a moment, of contemporary Jewry might continue to grow in order to stay at the edge of ceaselessly evolving and ever-intriguing Jewish and global realities and facing the existential challenges, to some extent new and unprecedented to Jewish existence. A further emerging question concerns the role of pure and applied research, training methods and programs, and the ability of scientific research to penetrate the world of institutions and influence a broader public discourse. Since its inception, the Institute was bound to project insights and relevance to a wider body of academic and non-academic practitioners and lay constituencies. Activities in this direction were the regular training courses for senior and junior officers of Israel's foreign ministry, the establishment of a circle for the study of diaspora Jewry at the house of the President of Israel, still running, though now temporarily suspended. Several years later, always at Moshe Davis' initiative, Several years later, always at Moshe Davis' initiative, came the creation of the International Center for the Teaching of Jewish Civilization in universities throughout the world. However, one more ambitious example of a concept of a Center for Applied Humanities was the creation in the 1990s at the Hebrew University of the Center for Jewish Continuity, devoted to curricular and extracurricular activities. The center actually intended to bear the renewed flag and slogan of the University of the Jewish People. The idea behind the center was to develop a tool that would put to full fruition the vast and uniquely competent human capital of Hebrew U faculty to the benefit of the Jewish people. In 1995, the then university president Hanoch Gutfreund appointed a committee largely composed of members of the institute, asking them to identify the needs and locate solutions. The committee selected a target group of about 100 leading figures all across the contemporary Jewish world and reached out to interview them and pick up their wisdom. Two main questions we asked them were, one, what are the main needs standing in front of contemporary world Jewry? And two, in which meaningful way can the Hebrew University of Jerusalem address those needs? Having been quite centrally involved in that enterprise, I can say that one of the most fascinating experiences was to find that a disparate group of over 100 leading Jewish academics and intellectuals, lay leaders and senior professionals in Jewish organizations who do not know each other across 5 or 6 continents, comes up with a coherent short list of topics and recommendations. And I think it is still worth reading this list of the perceiving emerging needs among world Jewry, at least as they were about 10 years ago. Here we have 12 points, and they were clearly repeated over and over. 1, the quest for Jewish content and meaning. 2, preserve and explore Jewish culture. Create and develop powerful Jewish ideas. Promote Jewish learning and scholarship. Support use of the Hebrew language. Develop research and strategic planning. Cultivate Jewish lay leadership. Encourage Jewish professional development. Radically increase the number of students exposed to Israel experience. mobilize community support for Jewish continuity, sustain Jewish family and community life in diaspora and Israel, and finally, exploit new technology opportunities in the fields of communication and distance learning. Three main recommendations for Hebrew U emerged from the survey. One, scanning and monitoring of critical data and policy-oriented research should continue to establish an agenda for securing a meaningful future for the Jewish people. Second, the university's resources should be strengthened in light of growing understanding of the needs of the Jewish people. And three, a strategic center should be established to implement the university's mission to serve as the University of the Jewish people and develop policies in this domain. Following these recommendations, the Center for Jewish Continuity was actually established on Mount Scopus with the sponsorship of Mort Mandel of Cleveland, Ohio. However, after a relatively short period, University President Menachem Magidor initiated a reviewing process, at the end of which the center's functioning was deemed insufficient and the project was discontinued. This experience remains highly interesting as a first attempt of a systematic mapping of the needs of world Jewry from an academic perspective of applied research. Like those already mentioned of the JPPI, the findings remain relevant as a basis for further study, research, and teaching. One last point, and not a minor one, is that we must be aware that its successes and international standing in contemporary Jewish studies notwithstanding, the Avraham Harman Institute of Contemporary Jewry is not a reality automatically bound to perennial existence. The Hebrew University initial mandate rests on three pillars. One, to be an academic institution of excellence. Two, to be a university that will contribute to development of the Middle East. And three, to be the University of the Jewish people. It is hard to deny that the Institute has been and should be a cornerstone as part of the latter concept. Actually, no other university in Israel or in the rest of the world has a comparable research and teaching program covering the different aspects of contemporary Jewish civilization and experience. Students-wise, the Institute is currently the largest department within the humanities graduate program. Quite obviously, to have such an institute, one needs a sufficient critical mass and topical articulation of faculty members. Every effort should be made to keep the institute's teaching faculty at least at its current size and disciplinary diversity, but possibly increasing it. This would require an explicit commitment that each senior faculty who retires because of age limits be replaced with other faculty of the same standards of excellence. In Israel and across the world, the Institute has an image of constituting a sort of academic empire. Unfortunately, this is at present not the case. Currently, not counting the emeriti, the Institute rests on no more than 7 full-time tenure tracks, subdivided between 10 full-time or part-time academics, a drastic reduction vis-à-vis the situation in the 1970s or the 1980s. In addition, several external teachers heroically contribute to the Institute's program. Any further reduction of the Institute's faculty size, and because of planned retirements, such a reduction will surely occur at the end of the current school year, undermines the ability not only to train others, but also to direct the research divisions that constitute the Institute's unique framework. This is tantamount to abuse the concept of contemporary Jewish studies and the very concept of the University of the Jewish people. It also contrasts with the increasing numbers of graduate students and the excellent quality of the Institute's graduates. The University Faculty of Humanities is currently undergoing a process of reevaluation and reorganization following recommendations initially developed under the leadership of Professor John Gauger of Princeton. While in the initial report, the Institute receives high marks as a successful example of multicultural integration, the recommendations tend to go in the direction of disciplinary consolidation, accompanied by transversal interdisciplinary programs. The reduction of contemporary Jewry from an institute to a program, or worse, a subdivision of Jewish history, would be a fatal setback as against the last 48 years. Ways and means must be found to strengthen the existing structure, also through enhanced collaboration with other units in the humanities, the social sciences, namely the Melton Center for Jewish Education in the Diaspora, the program in Jewish Communal Service at the Berwald School of Social Work, and the expanding programs at the Rothberg International School. Strengthening the research and teaching capacity at the Institute of Contemporary Jewry through expanding and sharpening the range of topics and projects and promoting cooperation with other academic units will hopefully enhance the goals of a strong and relevant Hebrew University of Jerusalem. It may also provide the necessary academic tools to help better understanding, in a global context, the recent past, the present, and the future of Jewish peoplehood. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor DellaPergola, for your historical overview and evaluation of the current status of contemporary Jewry at the Hebrew University. Unlike what I said at the beginning, we decided after Professor DellaPergola's eloquent and comprehensive summary not to hold a discussion. On my part, I would like to end this session by wishing Professor Gidon Shimoni many more years of fruitful research and good health. And now I'd like to invite Professor Shimoni to say a few concluding remarks and to close this conference. Please.
Thank you. I believe it is possible to draw some strains of linkage between what I consider the wonderful, profoundly stimulating and questioning keynote lecture that we had from Michael Walzer to what we heard today, starting with the incisively analytical remarks made by Eli at the beginning of today's session. But I've got some good news for you. I have no intention, on the grounds of chemla, that's to say, humane compassion, I am prevented from attempting this. But I do want to say, both personally and on behalf of the participants and the lecturers whom we thank, and indeed on behalf of the Jewish peoplehood, thank you to a few people, first and foremost, Dalia Ofer, without whose idea, resolution, and special touch this conference would never have taken place, and two figures that have been disappearing and emerging in the background here, Nitza Genut and Shmuel, formerly Sergio Balnai, who assisted her, who miraculously pulled this whole thing together, starting, I think, over a year ago, and I want to express deep appreciation to them. And lastly, let me say on a personal note, something comes to my mind. First of all, I've discovered that there is tremendous innovation in the Jewish tradition, even as to the rites of passage in Judaism. There is now, it seems to me, from my experience, something like a bar mitzvah, which is called perhaps a bar gimlaut. And I have been the beneficiary of this. Now, I once heard it said that, as a consolation to people who retire, that retired professors never go senile. They only lose their faculties. What this has proved to me personally, starting with a statement of the dean of the faculty on the opening night, reassurance that I have not yet lost my faculty.